but for Bill Gates, the pressure would have been far greater on Moderna and Pfizer, both directly and I think just sort of like in terms of what the perspective is on all this. Will you talk about, Gates's role in this and, his fealty to monopolies over these things has sort of trumped making sure that we don't have a problem with COVID or a really legitimate attempt to get everyone vaccinated?
Yeah, well, you were right when you said that it would have been a lot harder for these companies to make the case that they should retain complete control of IP during a pandemic, because they're not very adept at making moral arguments that don't really exist. And we saw this during the HIV/AIDS crisis when they eventually had to climb down from their lawsuit against Nelson Mandela. And what do you know? This is right around the time Bill Gates pops up on the public health scene as he's being sued for antitrust on 2 continents. And he has this enormously expensive reputation laundering operation kick in. And when he lands on the global public health debate, he lands on the side of the companies who were being excoriated around the world for suing the Mandela, trying to produce or import generic antiretrovirals. Since that time, in the intervening 20 years, he has built up this very well-known philanthropic organization focused on global public health issues. And whatever absolute good some of those programs have accomplished, they play a very important function in a larger debate around the system that creates these enormous inequities in the first place. And he has shown zero interest in questioning the assumptions underlying this system, including during the pandemic. Crucially, during the pandemic, when there was a discussion taking place about making vaccines a global public good, of suspending rules as usual, business as usual, when governments were using this language, and there was a medicines access movement pushing hard to create space for alternatives, who shows up again? Bill Gates, the good guy, with a solution that he claims can solve this problem. And he says, look, we don't have to suspend business as usual. We can have equity. We can solve all these problems. Suddenly you have medicine access groups on one side, the industry on the other, and then a triangulation taking place. And the more you look at Bill Gates's role in his groups, the harder it becomes to avoid the conclusion that he's essentially running an extremely effective interference operation for the pharmaceutical industry, because these conversations take on a very different dynamic when he's in the picture.
But that's how that's how he became a very wealthy man, is by propping up intellectual property rights, and both in his, the computer field, and now he's taken that to the global stage in terms of global health. Like, that is what is so fascinating to me. And there are some cracks in his public persona as this big philanthropist, but can you talk a bit more about how he specifically has laundered his role in keeping drugs away from people and protecting intellectual property, and making it seem like he's actually some sort of benevolent billionaire who's providing those drugs for the rest of the world?
Yeah, I mean, you're right that it's who he is in a very fundamental way. But the weird thing about Gates is it goes back even before he made his money. When he was just a geeky teenager, sort of getting his toes in the early Silicon Valley scene, he was writing these screeds against the open source ethos of the early Silicon Valley, which was partly a result of that Bell Labs antitrust suit that we talked about earlier, because the Silicon Valley understood that that's kind of where they come from. And also there's the psychedelic influence, who knows? But Gates was like this lone figure early on, arguing very loudly and obnoxiously for knowledge monopolies, even as a teenager. It's kind of bizarre. So yes, this is who he is. And in the context of the 2 great pandemics of the last quarter century, he has come down with all of his resources and influence to try to keep the global IP regime, as enshrined in the World Trade Organization's TRIPS regime, very much firmly on its rails. And he has devoted all of his influence in the media, his financial influence, his influence in international institutions, including the World Health Organization, to make sure that argument does not proceed and that IP is enshrined under all circumstances, including global public health crises.
Has the failure to get the world vaccinated and the failure of was it COVAX, right? Is the thing that came out of the UN?
Yeah.
Has that failure been sort of like digested and people have reacted to it? Or is it just sort of like, it feels like it's just sort of like filtered into the ether and nobody's really talking about it? Because he had specific sort of like proclamations as to how this was going to go, and it didn't go that way.
No, it didn't at all. You're starting to see some reckoning there. The Washington Post had a piece, I think, a week ago that pretty much went down the list and explained the timeline and the major conceptual failures of COVAX. Interestingly, Gates was barely mentioned, even though it was pretty much staffed by his people and run by his people and was very much his brainchild.
My understanding is that the entire project was really just a way in which to sort of intercede in the idea that there's going to be shared knowledge for all of these vaccinations.
Yeah, at the time that he introduced COVAX and the accelerator of which it was a part, because it also dealt with therapeutics, the larger framework, there was a mechanism being developed within the WHO called the COVID Technology Access Pool, which was going to be a globally shared resource in which all governments and corporations would temporarily, for the duration of the pandemic, place their IP. So there could be, research without walls. The idea it would accelerate development and also accelerate scale up, because once you have vaccines and therapeutics, you have to make a lot of them. If you have a pandemic affecting billions of people. And he showed up, he landed, and he said, no, none of that's necessary. And he used his influence, his many armed influence, to basically steer governments away from it. And basically say that the companies are right. We can tap into the better instincts and charity and benevolence of big pharma. And their patron states can solve this problem without any outside the box thinking.
I mean, that's a kind of a macro copy of what we see here in the United States, where philanthropy is a way to avoid taxation and larger cuts into the coffers of rich people and corporations. And then on the international level, waiving IP would stop the gravy train, even though these pharmaceutical companies made a ton of money as is, but it would stop eventually if you were to waive IP. And so then there's like conversations about, let's make it about donations, because then it's all on your terms.
Yeah, it's much more friendly terrain for corporations whose main and only concern is maintaining IP. And it's worth remembering that at the beginning of the pandemic, when the first billions were offered in Operation Warp Speed, a group of Democratic congressmen tried to revive this older liberal tradition of publicly funded science in the public interest under some minimal public constraints. And what was pharma's response? Stephen Ubel, the guy who runs the main lobbying group, said, if you try to attach even the slightest social obligations to this tranche of $8 billion, we will take our ball and we will go home. We will not participate.
I understand that threat. And I also just need to editorialize for a second. The reason why you don't want to allow for the existence of billionaires is because I think Bill Gates is not doing this to make money as much as like the guy's, a loon about this stuff, and it's his ideology. And it just so happens that because he's a billionaire, he gets to impose his ideology on the entire world when it comes to vaccinations. That's just like, you should not be allowed to have that much power in a country or the world, period. End of story. But this part about, we'll take the ball and go home. Two-part question. One is, was it within the ability of the U.S. government to say, fine, because there's other people who have other balls, and if we develop this with our money, they're going to sign up for it? A. And B, do we have a sense of like just how much money was expended on the development of these vaccines? We can take the mRNA, we can also take the Johnson & Johnson, and how much money was expended on the development of these vaccines in pure dollar amounts versus the amount that the U.S. government either gave them as, money directly in terms of the development for those vaccines, or in the promise of whatever you come up with, we're going to give you $1 billion worth of orders, which is like, if I'm going to start my podcast and someone comes up to me and goes like, look, we're not going to put any money into you, hiring people and putting the computers, but we're going to promise to buy $1 million worth of advertising from you, regardless of what you come up with. I'd be like, all right, I'll put that money into these computers because I know I get $1 million coming. And that's sort of the deal that we had with Pfizer, right?
Something like that. Regarding the ease with which we could have walked away, it would have been a lot easier if there hadn't been disinvestment or a complete rejection of the creation of some sort of public sector with pharmaceuticals. And part of the story of the last 40 years around the world was a privatization, disinvestment in public sector pharmaceuticals in Europe, which is now why you're seeing more and more conversations about we need to get that capacity back so we're not dependent on corporations, foreign or domestic. We have to be able to do this on our own. Without that, because we have been so enthralled to the privatization, private contractor model, we did need probably significant corporate partnerships. Now, within that, there is a lot of historical precedent for the government maintaining a role as a senior partner, going all the way back to the penicillin project during World War II. There are legal rights the government has to perform that role, even outside of an emergency context, as during the pandemic. I'm sure you've talked about a lot of these on the show, not just in Bayh-Dole, but the Defense Authorization Act. There are a lot of levers in the government toolbox that could have been used that just were not. I mean, basically, the industry got what it always gets and what it has come to expect as its birthright, which is everything on its terms with zero demands in the public interest or the government making any sort of even feigning self-respect in terms of enforcing the rights that any industry would themselves claim under a similar arrangement. These companies would never in a million years forfeit the rights that the government does on a routine basis with these contracts.
Well, it's fascinating stuff. Alexander Zaitchik, author of Owning the Sun, A People's History of Monopoly Medicine from Aspirin to COVID-19 Vaccines. This is...
I love the title.
It's a really important book, I think, for people to understand this dynamic, and because it tells the story of both this dynamic of socializing the costs and privatizing the profits. It tells the story of the implications of that, particularly in terms of medicine, where we have, God knows how many people have died and will die because of the privatization of these vaccines. And it also tells the story of like how sort of incrementally, it's almost like the frog in the boiling water. First, you limit the capacity of governments to produce these things. Then you give them these companies the leverage, and then it's it's off to the races. I really appreciate your coming on, and we will put a link to Owning the Sun at majority.fm and in our podcast descriptions and whatnot. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.